Okay. Good morning. I'm Suneel. I'm at the Masood Entrepreneurship Center, which is just down the corridor, and I'm chairing the session. Just want to give a bit of context to the session. It's all about circular economy. So a little bit of context. In the last 5 years, we've consumed a whopping 500 billion tons of materials. That's nearly what we have consumed in all of the 20th century. That's a lot of materials. Though the amount of materials consumption is increasing, the circularity has fallen from 9% in 2018 to 7% in 2023. Europe is slightly better, 11% circular. So we're consuming more virgin materials than ever, actually, and the amount of secondary materials is falling. And it's Christmas time, lots of gifts and lots of needless gifts. So one of the immediate effects of this obviously is increase in waste, excessive packaging. Therefore, we need to make use of the generated waste through high quality recycling and return high quality secondary materials back to product manufacturing. But in addition to recycling of technical materials, we also need to go into the bio-based economy. We need to replace part of it, at least. Solution needs to come from replacing fossil fuels with bio-based economy. But this isn't very easy when it comes to bio-based materials. Venture capitalists usually ask, where's your demonstration plant? And there's a valley of death situation. So our speakers today will be looking at some of the challenges in increasing the circularity of materials, but also looking at transitioning into a bio-based economy. So first speaker, Dr. Helen Holmes, will be looking at the complex subject of fly tipping behavior. After that, Jane and Elizabeth, they'll be looking at barriers to adopting more clean, non-toxic fashion. And finally, Dr. Neil Dixon will share insights on economic barriers to scaling up biomanufacturing. Helen.
Thanks, Suneel. So back to me again. Hopefully, I'm going to try and make this interesting for people. So our UMRI project was probably about 2 years ago now, when the system of the way the projects were organised was a little bit different, which I can get onto in a moment. But the waste tip was an idea that came out from a larger project called One Bin to Rule Them All, which many of you may have heard about already. And within that project, we were looking at recycling within different households and what were the barriers to recycling, household plastic recycling in particular in Greater Manchester. And when we were speaking to residents, the issues of fly tipping came up quite a lot. Does everyone know what I mean when I say fly tipping? Because it's actually quite a UK-centric term. It's basically like illegal dumping is the general term, but as I'll get onto in a minute, the definition is quite complicated. So we decided we'd apply for an UMRI grant to really try to get to the bottom of what was going on with fly tipping, what could we find out about fly tipping, because there really isn't much academic literature around on the topic. So part of a wider interdisciplinary team, as is the remit within UMRI. People from Suneel himself from the business school, and then from Mike from materials, we had others from engineering, to really try and bring together lots of different voices around the practices of fly tipping, but also the initial remit was thinking about how we might circularize fly-tipped items. I'm going to confess we didn't get that far, partly because of the way that the UMRI projects worked at the time, which meant we were delayed in recruiting a postdoc, delayed in getting ethics, but that's all been sorted now. But we got to a reasonable point within the project, which is what today's focused on. So in particular, we were interested in understanding the who, the what, the where, and the why of fly tipping. As I said, there is really little academic literature around about fly tipping from both the social and the physical sciences. It's one of those topics which sort of seems to have been missed. Anything that is available is about a decade old, so not really taking into account different practices today, the number of online deliveries that we all receive, packaging increases. So really trying to get to grips with what's going on in the contemporary landscape around fly tipping. We had a few ethical constraints, which I need to mention. Obviously, the ethics procedure can be quite cumbersome to get through. So we took the decision, because we only had 8 months on the project to be able to get anything done, that we weren't actually going to speak to members of the public, because it would just be too difficult to get through ethics because of the sensitivity around the topic, people admitting to doing things which are technically illegal. So we decided we would speak to waste professionals, and this proved useful. But if I was to expand on this, which I hopefully will in the future, the remit would be broader, definitely to members of the public. So we conducted semi-structured interviews with waste professionals working in Greater Manchester, and those waste professionals had varying different titles, from operatives and street cleansing operatives on the street to managers of waste teams to local councillors as well. And the postdoc, Julia Purcell, also did lots of field trips with those waste professionals as well. So she went out on the streets with the teams, seeing what fly tipping was occurring within Greater Manchester. So if you can see that properly, this is the legal definition of fly tipping. So defined as the illegal disposal of household, industrial, commercial or other controlled waste. So that definition seems quite set, doesn't it? But what we actually found through the research is that the way that is interpreted is very subjective, and that then leads to problems further downstream about what happens with fly tipping, who gets blamed, and consequences for policy. So to give you a few stats, fly tipping occurs 1.09 million times a year in the UK. That's alongside 2.25 million pieces of litter which are dropped every day in the UK. In terms of the proportions, a lot of people seem to think when we think of fly tipping, it's a mattress, or it's an unscrupulous commercial contractor who's done some work and dumped some asbestos or something else somewhere. Actually, the majority of fly tipping is household waste. And as we'll get onto in a minute, that household waste is not maybe what you think it is. So 35% is commercial, 65% is household. So I've got 3 main findings which came out from the project. We've got a report and a paper as well, which I'll flag at the end if you want to read more. But the first one is around this definition and the complexities of defining fly tipping. So has anyone ever not had enough bin space and put a black bin bag full of their excess waste next to the bin? Anyone? Yep, happens quite frequently, especially in Greater Manchester, where they have shrunk the general waste bin sizes. So in some local authorities, that would be classed as fly tipping. It's called side waste. And the majority of household fly tipping, which can get picked up by the local authorities, is this side waste practices, or practices of side waste. And this reveals quite a lot really about whose responsibility it is for fly tipping. So it's a big issue as to whether that side waste gets classified or not. So some teams within the local authority will classify it, others won't. So then you get instances then where people think, and members of the public think, oh, well, they took it this time, they'll take it again. So you can already see how there's a lot of subjectivity around what is happening, where something's in place and what it is. Charity donations are another example of some of that confusion. So you get a bag through the door and you can put some charity clothing in there, and then you put that out on your doorstep, or you put that out on the street. That often also gets misinterpreted as fly tipping, or could be classed as fly tipping. So the first thing we found is that there's this real sort of contestation over these terms, and there's tensions between local authorities and between members of the public as to what counts as fly tipping. And that often isn't just what it is, but also where it is, and sometimes who's put it there as well. So what we find is that there's these public-private distinctions become blurred. So, some people will complain about people fly tipping in their back garden. Back gardens are generally classed as, or front gardens or yards are classed as private space. But those distinctions become blurred, and those tensions then arise because of this. So what we see is that there is spaces that become transitory zones of tension between the local authority and members of the public, and that creates problems. So just a quick quote, I'll let you read that. I need to keep my eye on the time. So the second way finding leads on from the first. So what we find from the fact that it's difficult to define what fly tipping is, and it really depends on the local authority, but not just that local authority, but teams within that local authority. So one team may class something as fly tipping, another one won't, is that this creates gaps in waste infrastructure, and it creates problems because it's difficult then to measure and assign responsibility for fly tip waste. So what we're finding in increasing years is that there's more pressures on local authorities due to targets, particularly recycling targets, but also that they're severely under-resourced, that then puts them under more pressure and creates more problems within the system. So what we found from our interviews with the waste professionals is that often fly tip waste might get rolled into other categories of waste, so it then becomes really difficult to define. We then have another added problem of recycling targets, which mean local authorities are forced to classify that side waste at the side of the bin as fly tipping, because if they collect it as just general waste, that increases their general waste tonnage. So it looks like they're not doing as well on recycling. So there are all these tensions that start to play out and are playing out ongoing within the streets of Greater Manchester and the rest of the UK. The cutting of budgets has meant that, I've said, councils have really felt the pinch. So often they don't have the time or even the resource or the systems to be able to properly measure and classify fly tipping. So it then just gets dumped or put into one whole category. And then there are issues as well of when it does occur, when it occurs, say, for a commercial reason. You might get someone like an unscrupulous contractor leaving a load of waste somewhere or leaving a waste at someone's doorstep. It's really, really difficult to then prosecute because you've got to find sufficient evidence. There are issues of witness intimidation. And then often you get people who will just accidentally fly tip as well and not realise. So all this creates what we're terming gaps in the waste infrastructure, the inability to be able to correctly measure and define what fly tipping is and how much there is of it. So this is a quote from Harold, who was one of the environmental action unit managers, and this is basically about this target to hit 55% with the recycling, and that they just can't do that if they're going to collect side waste, these black bin bags by the side of the bin. So the third and probably biggest finding from the project is more about the why of fly tipping. So why does fly tipping occur? So we've split this up into socio-economic factors in the built environment, and there's two elements of this. One's around inequalities and the other one is around the urban landscape. So many of our participants, bearing in mind they're waste professionals, when we asked why people fly tipped or why they thought people fly tipped, their immediate answer was because it was to say something like, it was economically motivated, they couldn't be bothered, to go to the tip, or they couldn't be bothered to pay for someone to come and remove their excess waste, or they were just too lazy to do anything else with it. So that's sort of a standard narrative, isn't it? I think, and we often get this around waste. It's the poorer people who can't be bothered to engage with recycling, and a lot of our work has tried to undo some of those narratives, and this is another one. So when we pushed at the participants as to why they thought that, much more started to emerge, and they started to talk about the complexity of what is happening in people's lives, the complexity of different forms of inequalities and intersecting inequalities, and the impact that has on how people then manage their waste. So it's not just a case of people not doing the right thing, which is often what we find in waste policy as well, particularly policies which are focused around behavioural change, but rather there's this range of intersecting factors, and these are just some of them, and the paper that we've written goes into more detail. So first, we've got transient populations. Often those transient populations may have some language barriers. They may be digitally excluded. Digital exclusion is actually quite high in the UK. It's about 4% of the population, and 22% of the population don't have the digital skills to perform an everyday online task. Given that a lot of waste management information is online, having that access is actually really important. So there's, as you say, there's a range of different factors: communication, digital inequalities, but then other things as well, such as housing tenure. You know, it might be a person who is subletting from somebody else. They are not given any information. They're probably not even given the right bins to be able to dispose of their waste properly. So it's considering this range of factors. And then the second part of this, and these, as I said, are intersecting, is the urban infrastructure. So housing type, areas of high density housing where there's very little space for bin provision, or it might not necessarily be clear where waste goes or where bins go, where it's difficult for waste and bin wagons to get around. All of this were talked about by the participants as accentuating the issues of fly tipping, particularly this sort of household side waste fly tipping, but others as well. And then a key thing that came out from this, which was quite an interesting finding, is this notion of fly tipping hotspots. And you might know of a few in Greater Manchester if you live locally. So this is certain areas and certain spaces which become known as the place to dump things. And lots of the participants talked about how part of the issue with this is because they go in too quickly to clean them up as well. So there's an expectation then that if you put something in that particular location, the council will come away and they'll clear it away for you. So we keep doing it. So it's the broken window theory. If something's already broken, you know, why would you bother to keep it neat and clean? We carry on with the practice. So just a couple of quotes to summarize that. Sorry, social scientist, I should say that. So everything's full of quotations. So the top one, is more about the built environment. And the second one is also about the built environment. More rubbish that people can fit in their bins. So to summarise, because I'm conscious of time, our research found that we can't have this one-size-fits-all approach, which is what we have in a lot of waste policy at the minute. This idea of behavioural change, where it's right or wrong, and you either do it or you don't do it, because that isn't working. We've got terrible recycling rates, stagnant recycling rates within the UK of about 44%. Fly tipping is not going down. In fact, it's increasing slightly year on year, particularly with the pandemic was especially a bad year. So what can we do about this? We need strategies that move beyond this one-size-fits-all. We need to take in that complexity of people's lives and the complexity of the urban environment as well, within which they live. So how can we account for that diversity, be that the restrictive urban design, the housing tenure, their type, or the different multiple and often intersecting inequalities that they face? What we have seen is that there's been some positive results around managed community neighbourhood spaces. So our colleague Sherilyn McGregor has done some great work in Moss Side that's been looking at these sort of managed community spaces, so alleyways where they've planted trees or put out planters and tubs to try and prevent fly tipping, and that's had a really positive effect. But as we argue in the paper, that's great, but we can't be always relying on volunteers to do these things. There has to be some support and some funding from the local authority and more broadly from policy as well. Otherwise, it's just another neoliberal community asset. So that's one argument we make. The other is that waste infrastructure urgently needs funding. These systems that are being used by local authorities are, by the sounds of it, archaic and are difficult to be able to properly and accurately measure the different waste streams that they receive. So funding and investment within that would be ideal. So just to finish off, and I know other people talked about their experiences of being in UMRI projects, we thought it was brilliant. We had a great time. We would have liked to have gone a little bit further with the project in thinking about how we can imply some of the circular economy principles, but we didn't get to that point. But it has become part of a much wider suite of waste work that I and colleagues are working on, and also feeds into, as Matt mentioned at the start, the new Just Centre, the SRC Just Centre, joined up Sustainability Transformations, because again, it's very much about this grassroots and community focused alternative ways forward. Thank you.
We'll perhaps take one question.
Hello. Yeah. Hi, Helen. Yeah. Thanks for the presentation. Actually, I have two questions, but maybe you can ignore one of them and focus on the other one. My first question is if you as a team were able to compare the case of Manchester with other cases and to identify similarities, and in particular with the global south, like where like fly tipping or illegal dumping is more the mainstream like way of treating waste than a side alternative. And my other question is, in terms of the approaches to solve the issue, were you able to take a look to the pay-as-you-throw systems that some kind of like very progressive and aggressive councils are trying to implement to solve this issue from the very beginning?
Thank you. Great questions. So the comparison of elsewhere, no, because this was such a short project, as often the case with UMRI, but we did do a big scope of the data that's available in the UK, and it isn't transparent, and there isn't a great deal of it either. So we looked around, but in terms of anything that's up to date, there's the DEFRA statistics, but they're not particularly broken down very well or very easily. It's more of a generic top level overview. I think the idea of looking at the Global South would be fascinating. I think from what I've read about the Global South and illegal dumping, it's slightly different practice. So as our project was mainly focused on household fly tipping, which is then this sort of delineation as to what that actually accounts for. Is it sideways? Are people dumping things like mattresses or fridges? I think it's slightly different and different practices, but I think it'd be really interesting to do something like that. The pay-as-you-throw thing, I think, is a great point. We're increasingly obviously seeing in the UK charges for different forms of waste. Most people may have to pay for a garden waste bin. I don't know whether that will come out as a blanket policy. I doubt that the government would be able to sort of get away with a blanket pay-as-you-throw policy, because we're already paying, and that's what your council tax is for, to deal with these things. But I think it's on the increase. One thing I would say is that there are schemes. They're often ad hoc to try to prevent fly tipping. So you might get a local authority that will go out with like a van, and they'll speak to local community groups and say, look, if you've got something that you want to get rid of, then bring it out at this time. So there are those more ad hoc things that go on that's not paid for, but that recognises some of these inequalities in the fact that people might not have access to transport to go to the local municipal recycling facility. So it's just trying to think there's piecemeal things, and I think that's the crux of it, that a lot of this is very piecemeal. And again, it's focused on this right or wrong behaviour.
Okay, so I'm really bad at using a microphone because I've got a really, really loud voice. So if I deafen anybody, I'm really sorry in advance. So thank you, everybody. I know that lunchtime is on everybody's mind, so I'll try not to go on about this too much. So welcome to our project anyway. So this is Premier. One of my colleagues, who is much more talented than me, came up with the title, and it's loosely based around progressive and emerging interdisciplinary, in brackets, biomaterials research. So we are a group of academics from all different backgrounds, so I'll introduce us all in a minute. And because we recognise what I'm going to talk about is such a huge problem, we decided that we'd look at it through the lens of sportswear, and more specifically through the lens of a football shirt. So you'll notice a theme developing here. So the team. So I'm Dr. Jane Wood. My background is in industrial textile technology, and my current research looks really at novel and bio-based textiles with a focus in fashion and clothing, but I don't know, keep this to yourselves. My real passion is in technical textiles. And I'm joined by my colleague, Libby Allen. So Libby also works in the Department of Materials in Fashion Business Technology. And we're going to talk a little bit more about her specific research focus in a minute. So we also had Arthur from the Department of Chemical Engineering and Eddie from the Royce Institute joining us. So we had quite a sort of heavy science focus. So we recruited Alex from the Tyndall Centre to help give a bit of balance. We also had another 2 team members as well. So we had Professor Rob Field from MIB, who has moved on from the university now. And then we also had a PDRA, Chris, who helped us with some of the information gathering. And we'll talk about that again in a minute. But no good team is worth its salt without a great leader. So our captain was Dr. Claudia Henniger, and she brought the social science aspect to the project. So Claudia isn't with us today. She's on extended leave at the moment, so I'm her deputy, her caretaker manager. So background to the project. One of the things that Claudia, Libby and myself look at quite a lot is around the polluting nature of fashion and textiles. I may or may not be preaching to the converted here, but we're bombarded nearly every day with more and more images of the polluting nature of textiles, how our environments are being polluted, how we're getting waterways polluted, how we have huge, huge mountains of clothing that we can't do anything with because they don't biodegrade. A lot of our clothing is made from synthetic textiles, so polyester, nylon. When I'm talking about this to undergrads, I usually do a show of hands around the room who thinks they're not wearing the synthetic. And we usually have a few hands go in the air. I won't embarrass anyone today in case anybody feels they want to put their hand up, because I always say, look at these people, they're not wearing any underwear. Because synthetics are what keeps our pants up. So elastane, elastics are inherent in a lot of clothing now. So we have a problem with synthetic textiles because they're oil-based. They generally don't biodegrade. So once we have them, they're with us for a very long time. So we could say, well, the solution then is to move to natural textiles. Why not? Cotton, wool, silk. People used to wear them before synthetics were invented. Why don't we go back to wearing them now? So there's 2 big problems with that. If we use cotton as an example, cotton, if we all said we're not going to wear anything else other than cotton from now on, the problem is there isn't enough space or water on the planet to grow enough cotton to clothe us all. We have similar environmental impacts with other natural fibres as well. But one of the biggest problems that we're seeing, and this is where Libby's research comes into play, is that we're seeing more and more microfibres being found in waterways, in the food chain. We're seeing lots of microfibres rock up in people's brains, in people's internal organs. They're being linked to all sorts of different horrible health problems. And one of the problems is that microfibres are not just synthetic. So because we're so used to having such demand on our clothing now, we engineer, we finish, we chemically treat most of our natural textiles with synthetic chemicals to such an extent that when you look at some of the analysis of microfiber now, there's a good proportion of these that are natural. So there's a good proportion that are wool, cotton, silk, because they've been so heavily chemically treated. So we've got a real big issue in fashion and textiles. So fashion and textiles takes on all sorts of different forms. So going back to the point, we decided to look at sportswear, and more particularly a football jersey. So 2 of the big things that we know about sportswear, and particularly within football, is that if you're an elite athlete, a professional player, you have very specific demands of your sportswear. So your sportswear needs to be high in performance. So it needs to keep you cool, it needs to keep you dry, it needs to be moisture wicking. But then football is quite a tribal thing. If you think about the fan base and the massive market that we have in terms of football shirts and football kit, and the big driver of this isn't necessarily performance, it's all around aesthetics. So that brand, that logo, the colours of your team, if we're talking about international level, the colours of your country. So sportswear gave us a really useful, and particularly football, gave us a particularly useful lens to look at, because we were considering the high performance characteristics of textiles and clothing and the high aesthetic integrity. What we do know as a group of researchers is that there are particular solutions that we could almost roll out almost straight away. If you ever have fallen foul to the LinkedIn algorithms, you, like I do, depends what circles you move in, I guess, but nearly every day on LinkedIn and every day in the press and on the internet, there is almost a new product coming out, I don't know, every single day. And these products are based on mycelium, they're based on microbial approaches. We've had clothing made out of pineapple, clothing made out of orange fibre, clothing made from cactus. So there's all these different solutions coming out. There's all these alternatives to synthetics and to natural textiles. And all of these things are emerging, and there's lots of companies that say, oh, this is the next big thing. But there's virtually nothing available to the mass market. Nothing has actually made it to mainstream. And this was one of the things that we wanted to find out, really. Why aren't these things making it? Sportswear is such a niche, particularly when we're talking about elite level, then surely that would be something that people would focus on if they were producing this new product. Focus on something niche and then it will spill out. And that's a general theory in fashion, but it doesn't seem to have happened. So we wanted to find out really why, what was going on. So as I say, the premier project was interdisciplinary. And what we wanted to do as a first stage is think, well, what are these barriers to adoption? Why can't we start to use some of these new textiles in sportswear? It was always the plan that this project was the foundation to a much, much bigger study, and it gave us some really, really interesting insights. So thus the journey of the football jersey was born. And just to give you an idea of what the wider project has started to look like, and this was always our intention, we want to start thinking about developing these bio-based materials a bit more with a specific end goal in mind, be that sportswear, be that high fashion, whatever it is. We want to look at dyeing and chemically treating processes. So is there a more sustainable angle to that? So could we use naturals? Do we have to engineer everything with synthetics? And then circularity, sustainability, end-of-life treatment. So all of those things are in our mind, and all of those things are what we're going on to do. But this particular UMRI project was laying the foundations for all of this. So Chris, our PDRA that the project funded, worked very hard with the team of academics, and we all reached out to our networks. So what we wanted to do was get a really wide variety of stakeholders. We really wanted to know what these barriers to adoption were. I have a real bugbear, and it's probably because of my industrial background, that you could create the most perfect fabric in a lab, in a university environment, and nobody would ever use it if you didn't involve the various stakeholders. And I think a few of the previous speakers have touched on that. So we wanted to find out what the various stakeholders thought, and we got a really, really great cross-section of people. So Chris conducted between 25 and 30 separate interviews. It was quite a hefty undertaking. It was quite difficult to track some people down. But as you can see, we've got a good range of stakeholders. What we didn't get as far as was the elite athletes. I'll do that job. I shouldn't be here. If it wasn't for Manchester City, I wouldn't be here. My mum and dad met there, so I'll volunteer myself for the interviews with the players of the first team. But what you can see is we got a good split of people. So we got brands, we got people who were selling these products and marketing these products, endorsing some of the teams. We got product developers, so we got people who were looking at the innovation, looking at the fit of the garments, looking at the coloration, looking at all those sorts of things. We got people who were getting down and dirty and actually manufacturing these products. And then we got hold of some amateur players. So what did we find from our interviews? This was really interesting. It was something that we had suspicions about, but it showed us an angle that we hadn't really considered. So we're just in the middle of analysing the interviews, but there's a common theme that's already coming out. And that is that people are very, very frightened of change. They're terrified of the unknown. So all the aspects that we thought we would uncover, we did. I'll talk about those in a minute. But it was this fear of the unknown, this fear of adopting something that isn't polyester. And it's quite scary because polyester hasn't been around as long as cotton or wool, but people are absolutely obsessed with this marvellous thing that is polyester. So people are really, really frightened of making that change. But what really, really shocked us all is that all of our interview participants were very, very aware of the sustainable aspects that needed to be considered. All of our participants were painfully aware of all of the stuff that you see in the news, so they were very aware of the polluting nature of textiles and clothing. And there was probably 2, maybe 3, that said they were actively doing anything about it in their professional practice. So all of the other stakeholders were aware, but very much had this idea, well, it's just us, what can we do about it? So we might as well carry on because there's not a bigger picture. So that was really, really interesting to find out, because I think as a group of academics, sometimes when we're studying in this space, we kind of assume that everybody else is aware of the issues as we are. As I say, that fear of change really came out, and then a lot of the people talked about the worry of the downgrade in performance. So there wasn't a lot of compromise to be had. If we said, well, we can produce something that is much more environmentally friendly than you've got now, it will biodegrade at the end of its life. We have a huge, huge problem just in the UK alone with disused football shirts at the end of season. So every season, the football team will produce a new colour of shirt, a new kit, but they still have stock from the year before. And nobody really wants that stock. So we have tons and tons and tons of football kit being donated to charity, but scarily also going to landfill. So we said, okay, so what if we can give you something that will last maybe the season, and then you don't have to worry because it'll biodegrade? Nobody was interested in that. It was really, really interesting, a really interesting finding, because they thought we'd get much better uptake. And the fundamental worry was the performance. If something's going to biodegrade so quickly, I'm worried that it's going to biodegrade over its useful life, and therefore we're going to get this compromise in performance, we're going to get this compromise in aesthetic. But the other big thing that people were also worried about was cost. They started to say, well, new products, new innovations always cost so much more money than the current things that we have, so we're unwilling to change. But if we think about cost in terms of how we traditionally make garments, so we have a sheet of fabric, we cut out the panels of the garment, and all the peripheral fabric that we don't use goes in the bin, you're essentially putting that money that you spent on buying that fabric in the bin. And a lot of the novel textiles that we were looking at didn't produce any waste, but still our participants were really, really worried about that cost implication. So I think we came to the conclusion that one of the big things that we have to do as our first port of call is education, a real education offensive against for people who are thinking about using this product, thinking about using biomaterial. So now we have that foundation information. This is what the rest of the season looks like for us. So we're going to carry on looking at the development of these materials, mindful that at every stage of their development, we're going to have to engage these stakeholders, because we feel that engagement is really going to help us with adoption when we start to crack some of the big problems around durability, around aesthetic integrity, around performance. developing those processes. So it might not be that we come up with the perfect fabric all of a sudden. It might be an incremental change that we come up with a more efficient dyeing process, a more environmentally friendly way of imparting wicking or breathability to our fabrics. And then we're going to have a really good look at this life cycle, because we feel that that will be a really key part of educating some sportswear manufacturers and some sportswear users. But just to finish, I think in the same way as previous speakers have talked about the UMRI project, what this enabled us to do was really engage a wide variety of stakeholders, but also a variety of interdisciplinary academics that maybe we wouldn't have had the opportunity to do otherwise. And it really led to some really interesting insights. And when you get people in a room, I've been involved with projects where I've thought, I'm not really sure how I'm going to be able to contribute. Once you get all those academics together physically in the room and start to talk about things, the idea generation is exponential. I cannot recommend UMRI highly enough for some of the things that it brought to us. So, thank you.
We'll just take one question. Hi. Hello. I was just checking that. So thank you. One of my questions is that most of the what I believe is football jerseys or sportswears are manufactured somewhere in South Asia and other stuff, or those countries. So either going towards some kind of sustainable or a 1 year sustainable material which will biodegradable after a year will be helpful for the brands to go there, because then you have to go with the technology and then the cost, and then there is a fear, because if they do not produce such kind of a material, it cannot be helpful for B2B more sustainable. And then there is the other side, those manufacturers, how sustainable they are, how they can produce. So either you are considering that aspect in your research.
Yeah, so I think there's loads of things to unpick there. I could talk for a week about that. I think one of the things that strikes me is that there's a really big feeling that some of these materials are not quite up to the mark. So, you know, I picked a year as sort of a season, but I mean, we could engineer them to do all sorts of things. But one of the things that I found when I worked in sportswear in industry was even traditional fabrics, so fabrics that have been engineered to be wickable or have certain aesthetic qualities, had a very limited shelf life. So I know that when we were transporting sportswear from the Far East over to the UK, some of the dyes, some of the structure of the fabrics was particularly sensitive to heat and to moisture, so they might leave in perfect condition, but when they get to the UK, they're not quite as they were intended. So I think that isn't a particular challenge of the biomaterials, it's a challenge of materials altogether. But yeah, there is that global marketplace to consider. So yeah, we will be considering that. But that's a tiny bit of your question, I know, so maybe we can talk later.
Thank you, Jane.
Okay, I might try with that. Hi, good morning everyone. My name's Neil Dixon, and really pleased to be here. Thank you very much to the organiser and the host to give this opportunity to talk to you a little bit about our research, just a little bit at the beginning, but that will hopefully give you some context for our UMRI project entitled Pathways for Sustainable Biomanufacturing Futures. So I'd like to start off with this slide because it really frames a lot of the challenges and thinking of our research group. As we know, almost exclusively embedded carbon that industry uses currently comes from petrochemical feedstocks. This is carbon that doesn't go into fuels or energy production. This is carbon that goes into chemicals, into polymers, into materials, makes our medicines, clothes us, gives us components for our electricals, insulates our home. If you dial forward 25 years, there's going to be a huge transition in this industry sector So the demand for carbon is going to, embedded carbon in that year, in that time, is going to be double, but also where that carbon is going to come from. So it's going to be much more highly stratified, a lot more complex where this carbon is going to come from. It's going to be potentially seasonally variable. It's going to potentially have high moisture content. It's going to have co-contaminants and impurities. So it's going to need a whole series of new infrastructures, feedstocks, technologies, and workforce to try to address this new paradigm. And obviously, as a biotechnologist, I believe that biotechnology has a part to play in this future picture. And I'm going to unpack just a couple of slides, some of the technological approaches that we take in my research group to develop new systems to be able to make chemicals and biopolymers from sustainable, renewable carbon sources. So this is just a very quick snapshot of some of the research areas that we work on in terms of being able to make chemicals and biopolymers from renewable sources. We work extensively with researchers out in Brazil, where we will use agro-industrial residues to make chemicals, where we convert sugars and aromatics that come from biomass and convert that into chemicals, high-value chemicals, flavor and fragrances, and active pharmaceutical ingredients, for example. To allow us to do this, we need to engineer tools and technologies to make these microbes do things that we want to do. So we engineer a toolbox that allows us to turn on and off the cell and machinery to allow us to do this. We also work a lot on being able to import and export chemicals from microbial cells. For example, we've done a lot of work on how certain microbes can assimilate carbon that comes from polyethylene terephthalate, and understanding the transport mechanisms of how some of these monomers that come from these plastics can be derived and entered into cells. On the flip side, we also do some work where we make biopolymers, so polyesters, alternative to petrochemical derived polyesters that you can make in engineered microbial cells. Certain microbes use these polymers as a carbon sink, but we can engineer the metabolism of these microbes to make bespoke polymers with new enhanced features. So that's just a very quick snapshot of the premise of things one can do. So this is now going to try to recontextualize this. Obviously, as we know, we have this linear economy. We extract from the ground, we refine, we process, and at the end of its life, we throw away. That leads to greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to move to a greater circularity. Bio-based approaches have good pedigree, good example in this space. For example, first and second generation bioethanol, where sugars and cellulose, or sugars isolated from cellulose, are used to grow yeast, where bioethanol is produced through the fermentation process. And currently around the world, we make close to 30 billion gallons of bioethanol each year. And with highly modified engines, flexibles, you can drive automobiles up to a 90% bioethanol. However, as some of the other previous speakers already highlighted, there's just not enough arable land to make all the things we would want to be able to make from this energy crops, or from these crops that we use solely for sugars to grow microbes to make things. Indeed, if you try to model this out, even at that sort of 20% of embedded carbon coming from bio, that would mean around 10% of all arable land is required just for that commodity chemical. So you need to think more holistically. We need to think about carbon-based waste, and where do we throw away a lot of carbon, and can we close the loop and for this greater circularity? For example, can we start to think about waste resources and push these back around and close this cycle? So as an extreme example, we started looking at municipal waste. We make a lot of that around the world each year, a lot of fly tipping here, I guess you'd call it, where we produce 2 gigatons of this municipal waste each year. A third of that is openly dumped, another third ends up in landfill. If we look at the composition and volumes of this waste, it's really closely linked to GDP. The richer the country, the more waste they have. But also the compositions change. This is data from the World Bank. In lower income countries, it's dominated by food and green waste, whereas in higher income countries, there's a higher proportion of paper and plastics in that waste. However, a large proportion of this is carbon-based, and also a section of it is hydrolyzable. So we want to develop a proof of concept process of can we use this as a feedstock for microbial production and growth? So this is our kind of concept paper. This got published last week, where we've taken a series of hydrolyzable municipal-like waste fractions, carried out a mixed enzymatic hydrolysis, releasing monomers, and then engineer bacteria to assimilate that complex feedstock and produce a series of value-added biopolymers. Only one data slide I'm going to show you. I'm going to go through very quickly. The colored lines are the important bit. These are the carbon derived from waste. They are assimilated during time. And concomitant with that depletion is this microbial cell growth in black, and in grey is the assimilation of this polyhydroxyalkylate. So this is this bio-based plastic, this polyester material that has these properties that you can spin it, and you can do all sorts of properties with it. This particular one is a medium chain, so around 10 to 12 carbons in its backbone. Okay, so we can do lots of things, but should we do them? Does it make sense both from an economic and environmental perspective? So we teamed up with colleagues in chemical engineering. So this is in collaboration with Rosa Quilla-Franca's group. So we wanted to see, are these approaches sensible from an environmental and an economic perspective? We modeled a series of different scenarios of waste management. So if you take 1 ton of municipal waste, the different scenarios you could do with it are at the bottom here. So if you landfill, it's the worst of both worlds. 2/3 or 3/4 of that goes to greenhouse gas emissions, and it costs $150 per ton to process that. Our particular proposed process down here is very good on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, not quite as competitive on the economics. We understand where the challenges are around that process because we can do hotspot analysis and further iterate and improve on that process. But certainly you can say that we can make things more sustainably than burning or landfilling it, and we can start to compete on an economic value as well. And this is really important. We can do a lot, and we should do the right thing, but we live in a capitalist society, so we also need to make an economic reality to allow it to be adopted and driven forward. Okay, so that was the sort of more technical part. I'm going to zoom back out now and talk about the UMRI project. So we want to think about the challenges of new technology adoption and biotechnology adoption in a more holistic manner. Obviously, some of the challenges of adopting new technologies might just be technology readiness, robustness, scalability, but are there other drivers and other factors associated with the impediment of that technology adoption? Is it education? Is it workforce? Is it regulation? Is it infrastructure and investment and things that are needed to de-risk that? So we wanted to think about this, but focus it on a regional perspective. So we look about the northwest UK chemical manufacturing industry. So that's one of the 3 major centres for chemical manufacturing in the UK. And we wanted to try to zoom in on that particular sector and explore what some of the challenges would be for it to adopt a bio-based strategy. There's many reasons why you'd want to do that. Northwest is a high population area, potentially lots of integration between waste, carbon, how we could feed all that together. Obviously, a big educational and knowledge-based sector, and a willingness to do greater innovation, Merrill innovation zones, and so forth on our things here on campus as well to complement all this. So this is the team who you can see down at the bottom here. Some of the audience here indeed were named in the original budget, in the original project. The key person I think to really flag is the graduate intern, Ling-Li Vu. She just delivered all of this basically and really drove it forward in terms of getting all the charts and organizing meetings and so forth. So we had a series of different exercises. The first one was around sort of landscape mapping, looking about the size of the chemical manufacturing sector in the northwest of the UK, looking about emerging biotech companies, but also looking about traditional biomanufacturing companies. So thinking about food waste, food producers, thinking about breweries, thinking about those who work at anaerobic digestion, or indeed waste producers and providers. If you think about these future scenarios, a plant operator who works in a brewery would be very similar to a plant operator who would engineer and grow an engineered yeast to make a particular commodity chemical. Very transferable skill sets. So we wanted to try and map this out, what this might look like in the future. So all very qualitative at the moment, all data sourced from Companies House, but we have this data set. And we can map this on this visualization tool. So Ling-Li did this with Suneel, so thanks very much for the help on setting up this visualization tool. If you're interested, you can scan this here, QR code here, because this maps both those carbon processing industries in the Northwest and also those who produce and process that biogenic waste in the Northwest. We're just trying to integrate this future scenario. Okay, so after that initial mapping phase, we then had a series of stakeholder workshops, these foresight workshops, where we reached out to industry, regulators, educators, innovators, and so forth. I had 3 different workshops across these different themes, which you can see on the screen, looking about whether infrastructure or lack of infrastructure is a real impediment for technology scalability, looking around skills, both graduate and continuing professional development requirements, and looking around this future feedstocks. A lot of learnings from the anaerobic digestion industry, for example, who already have really good infrastructures for sorting, processing, and blending feedstocks. Again, QR code if you're interested. It's overlapping. On these, and we've had a series of reports that are also available online on the back end of this. Some other reporting out of this, we've also been working with policy at Manchester. 3 recommendations that have come out of our UMRI are highlighted here on the screen. These are around the need for investment to develop demo facilities to de-risk technologies. This is reported over and over again, both from SMEs, but also large industry, those looking to transition and adopt bio-based manufacturing technologies. Policy and regulation, really, really important to bring together to think about incentivizing the adoption of renewable carbon sources. And really, the final take-home message, and I think this works at the governmental level, but also at the discipline level, is that we need to think a bit more holistically. We can't be so siloed. This cuts across so many different areas. And from a government perspective, you can think about this going across DCIT, you can think about it going across DEFRA, touch on regional development, it's also net zero. So we really need to think really holistically how we all come together and try to address these challenges. So on the back of this, we've had some engagement with DCIT and we've been talking to them. We've had a number of calls and we're kind of following up on that as well, some specific policy recommendations going forward. Okay, so I think that was most. So this is a snapshot of all the things we've done. We've also been highlighted by an Innovate UK report that came out around the future feedstocks, around sustainable chemical manufacturing in 2050 that highlighted our work. And then subsequently or during this process, some of these processes and thoughts that we went through that were funded by the IMRI has been fed into a proposal which has now been awarded as part of an international collaboration. So this global centre has been led out of the US, funded by the NSF. Our portion is funded by the BBSRC, but it's very much along this theme about using waste carbon feedstocks, so plastics, biogenic, and C1 gases, using chemo and biohybrid processes to convert that into value-added chemicals, as well as all the other workforce development and ecosystem development. So this project from the UK side is being led by myself out here at Manchester, and we're due to start in May 2025, and we're recruiting a series of positions. So it's a 5-year program grant. Okay, so then just need to acknowledge all the people in my group. I think I acknowledged all the collaborators as we went through, both on the UMRI and other research, and then just flag up funders and my collaborators and group members, and say thank you very much for your attention.
We have 2 questions.
So I think one of the challenges with biomanufacturing is like feedstock control, right? And you even look at lignin, and you can grow a tree in one place and then grow a tree in a different place, and you get different yields and different properties. But of course, when you're then looking at waste, you have an exceptional level of complexity. And so how do you think that risk is going to get managed in future biomanufacturing scenarios to enable the efficiency of those processes to sort of be consistent enough that there's not an economic fallback?
Yes, it's a really good question, and it's a real key technical challenge. I think there's various different stages to that challenge. Some is the sort of the blending at the macromolecular level. Some is how you break that down into the individual components, and some is at the kind of the microbial metabolism level. What sort of microbes can deal with that seasonal, hourly kind of variability? I think there's some really good learnings from the anaerobic digestion industry. They do blend already a lot. They need to make sure that their bugs don't have too much sugar because they get fat and bloated, and then they don't do all the things you want to. You get really poor biogas yield of those areas. I think we want to avoid the scenario that we're shipping lots of biomass around the world. We want to think about it, and that's the idea here, that it is a distributed sort of feedstock, if you will, that it comes from where you want stuff, directly linked with population density. So on a technical level, I think the pre-treatment is probably the biggest challenge. I think it's the elephant in the room with all of this. Even if you look in the US, like how do you break down these polymers into individual monomers and then reuse them? And I think that's the biggest challenge. I don't think that we've cracked it at all with enzymes. Probably not the way to go, I think. But I think there needs to be a lot more work about biochemo interfaces. I think there's a big tick for bio in terms of being able to take complex feedstocks more than chemo. Yeah, we can do this catabolic funneling, take really complex feedstocks into central metabolism, into central monomers. And one of the key features of our bugs that we've used is the ability to adapt very quickly on a complex feedstock. You can really, really take it really well. Certain microbes can't have massive lag times as they move from one feedstock to another. So the metabolism of this is really, really key. So that's what we showed. That's the key of the paper.
Thanks, Neil. It's really, really interesting. I just got it's sort of off the top of my head, really, when you were talking, I started thinking about seaweed. So there's been this huge build-up. It was in the news recently of sargassum in the Caribbean. I'm wondering if that's a possibility for a feedstock, because I'm quite concerned about, as you mentioned in the talk, land availability of crops. So I was wondering if you looked into seaweed.
We haven't directly yet. I mean, we're an island nation, so it kind of makes sense that we should look at it. We don't have a tropical rainforest on our doorstep, so it is a logical way to go forward. A lot of groups are out there. It's got natural extractants anyway. It's got sugars like mannitol you can extract and use. It's also got the alginate. From an industrial processing perspective, it's also got lots of salty water in it. So that kind of leads to challenges of corrosion and extracting that water. And water removal is one of the biggest costs. That pre-treatment, that downstream processing, pulling that out, it adds huge cost to the process. So yes, we should, but I don't think we're completely there yet. To overcome that technical challenge. Okay, thank you.
Okay. I'll take single seat.
Yeah.
We can share. Yeah. So thanks everybody. So I've done stand up before, and if you want to know how to use a mic, you just pin it against the bottom of your chin, and then people at the back can hear you. So, so my name is Mike Shaver. I'm the OG director of Sustainable Futures. But this is the first time that I've been forced to wear our sexy new T-shirts. I think we need to think about the journey of our own shirts now. In thinking about those last sessions. And really what I wanted to do is to just open by talking about why Sustainable Futures exists, but then why we get money from the university to run events, right? Because this is a university that has responsibility to educate, right? And we need to remember that we really love research and doing things, but we also are an education institution. But we're also quite unique in that we're a university that has social responsibility as one of its core tenets. And when we think about social responsibility, it actually changes one of the ways we think about a main thing that the government and the public want us to do as universities, and that is to create impact. And so this word impact is something which is growing in discourse around funding, in discourse around why universities exist, certainly how us as academics are judged, is very much focused on that word impact. But what's really neat, and one of the things I really value about the University of Manchester, is that we actually can think about that word impact in a much broader way. And this creates opportunities for the university to fund things in different ways, right? And so the platforms exist to enable impact. It's to enable things that someone focused on a really deep and interesting problem in a research silo might not be able to address. And what we want is for those connectivities or those differences or those connections and the doing things differently to create more impact than a researcher would be able to do on their own, right? And so what you've seen today are, and what you will continue to see throughout today, it is a whole community of different researchers who have connected with different bits of our university so that they can create more impact. And what we've done in this session is to bring together people from different career stages and different roles within the university on what that means. Like, so developing impactful research from seedcorn funding, like, well, what do we mean by impact? What do we mean by the different funding sources? What do we actually want to try and deliver when we want to impact the world? And we want to do that in a way which promotes sustainability. And that means social sustainability, economic sustainability, and environmental sustainability. So we'll unpick some of those things today. And I'm going to be asking questions to our three panelists. So that's Bill Sampson first, and I'll get you to introduce yourself in a second. And then Ciara Mcgrath, who you've already heard about, but she's so great that we're getting you to hear from her again. And then Chloe Jeffries. So Bill, if you could just introduce yourself.
So, hi everybody, I'm Bill Sampson. I'm a professor in the Department of Materials. I joined this university a very long time ago, so it's had some impact on me. I came here as an undergraduate in 1986. I started off my career as a lecturer in the Department of Paper Science, which was a very industrially focused activity. So working with industry and work that's had impact has been key to what I've done over the last 30-something years in the university. I'm not going to go through my whole career because that'll take a long time. Over the last couple of years, last 5 years, I've been working in the GEEK as Chief Scientific Officer, and that's a very industry-facing activity. And over the last couple of years, I've been working with the Royce to bring some of the working models in the GEEK closer to the standard academic-facing world, but still with a rich flavour of interaction with industry.
So hi again to those who were here earlier as well. So I'm Ciara. I am a lecturer in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering. My background is in astrodynamics and space mission design. So essentially figuring out where we should put our satellites in orbit to get them to do the amazing things we need them to do. And since I've joined the University of Manchester, my research has been focused on how we can do that more sustainably. So how we can get the greatest benefit out of our missions to help life on Earth, and while minimizing the negative harms that they're creating as well.
Right, so thirdly, I'm Chloe Jeffries, and I head up the strategic funding team in the Faculty of Humanities. So this is a research development team that works with researchers to help them build and then hopefully secure projects for external funding. And just looking around the room, I can see a few familiar faces, but then a few people that I don't know, which is the perfect type of audience, because that means that there's more connections and links to be made. A lot of what we do alongside the platforms is about helping to build collaborations for external funding. It's increasingly hard, as Mike says, to work in silos, but to get funding as an individual, I'm not sure that you should either.
So just as a framing for what it is we're going to do. So I have three questions that I'm going to get each of you to answer those, give your perspectives, but feel free to jump back and forth in terms of a conversation between you. And then because we are stopping you from lunch, we will see what time it is and whether we have questions from the floor. And so I guess, so Bill, you mentioned the word geek, which of course we all are, but it also means Graphene Engineering Innovation Center, right? Royce is another weird thing. We've been talking about UMRI, which is not, UMRI is the University of Manchester Research Institute's fund, which actually isn't even a fund. It's the organization for all of our institutes. And of course, there's the mysterious seed funding pot that Ciara mentioned in her talk. And so we had this huge diversity of different kinds of mechanisms to support impactful research. And so I guess what my first question for you all, and if we start with Chloe at the end, like there's different paths to seed funding. There's different support mechanisms. How do they work with each other, and how do you sort of figure out a path to figuring out how best to support the research that you want to do?
The first thing I'd say is I think they require quite a lot of navigation, both internally and externally. We can partly help with that. It doesn't help that seed funding isn't always labelled as such. So I think we use a variety of terms, which are actually all trying to do the same thing. They're all trying to help to develop, build, tease out bits of a project. But sometimes we call it seed funding. Sometimes it's known as pump priming. Some of the external funders call it other things. The theme is sort of things getting faster or growing. So one of the external funders uses the word catalyst. So I don't think that sort of variety of terms helps. But with discussions, always happy to talk through people, what they're doing and why. And their purpose is, it's a little bit to try something out and to test things, either to test how you might work together. That's particularly true of researchers or partners who haven't worked together before or are coming from a slightly different area, or perhaps to test out a little bit of a methodology. So it is a chance to sort of test out and grow and have that development or incubation phase. And one thing I'll say about that, why I think that's increasingly important, alongside the point that we're now supposed to be working with more diverse teams, is that external funding is coming around in a way where there's perhaps shorter turnaround times. So something that I frequently get asked about is, I saw this call from UKRI, I saw this call from the European Commission. They want a very specific thing. How are we and there's only 2 months to apply for it. How are we supposed to do it? And actually, you're not supposed to do it. You're not supposed to go from seeing the call to, that's 0 to 100 in 2 months. And if you're staggered by that, that's probably that you're reading it in the wrong way. So this seedcorn funding, aka pump priming, aka catalyst, is there because the external funding landscape requires you to be prepared. You still need to keep a little bit of flexibility. I've seen, when seedcorn funding goes wrong, which is seedcorn funding then emerges with a very rigid, brittle project that is great, but could perhaps only take one external form, and that perfect external funding call might come along. But it's really important for you to do the prep so that you can be ready to just do that sort of final bit of development in response to the specific opportunity that comes along.
I can go, yeah. I think, thank you so much for setting that up, actually, because I think when I thought about this question, when Mike sort of posed it, as an early career academic, sort of coming into my first academic role at Manchester, I think I had two kind of misconceptions about the idea of these small seed pot fundings. And the first was I had this kind of idea of, it's an awful lot of effort sometimes, or it feels like an awful lot of effort to apply for what's a very small pot of money. And is this actually a good use of my time? Because as an early career academic, you feel like you're being pulled in a million and one directions. And actually, I think the benefits that come from it are so much greater than just the funding itself. And the second misconception I think I had was this idea that I needed to almost prove a concept. And you talk about proof of concept. But it was this idea that, okay, if I've got the funding and I've got this idea, I have to show it's going to work exactly as I thought so that I can then, roll on to the next thing. And I think actually the beauty of some of these pots of money, particularly in this interdisciplinary field, is that you don't know what you're going to find out. And what this actually is an opportunity to try something and see what happens. And in my experience, even when things have gone completely in a different direction than I've expected, people have been so excited and receptive to hear what we've learned, precisely because it's something new that nobody expected to find. So I think then thinking about those different pots of funding, and as Mike mentioned, I got kind of a small pot right at the start of my journey, which was only enough to buy about a month of PhD student time and sort of do some activities with industry. But that was what kind of rolled on to become the sort of UMRI work that we're doing now. But I think that the two big benefits that we got from that was, one, especially as someone coming new into the university, I felt like the university believed in what I was trying to achieve. I'd come in with a new idea for research, trying to establish myself in a field, doing something different. And when I got that grant, I kind of skipped home and I thought, oh yeah, they believe in me. This is great. Somebody's behind me and thinks that there's something here. So I think that's the first thing. And I think the second thing is that, there was an awful lot of people involved in all of these projects. And for us, at least, when we started off, it was an awful lot of kind of cramming in an hour here and there once a month, maybe over pizza, maybe over coffee, to try and come up with these ideas. And we were clear there was a problem, and we were clear there was a role for lots of different disciplines to feed into that solution. But actually having the UMRI grant behind you gives you that momentum, because everybody's already passionate and everybody's already putting in more hours than they're being paid to do, probably, to kind of get this research off the ground. But having that bit of momentum behind you to actually pay for a postdoc, get some tangible work done and get some outputs, it gives everyone an excuse to actually spend time in that room and get things moving. So I think that was the other thing that was really important.
Yeah, right. So I'm not going to dwell on the university funding aspect of it. Actually, I'm going to, because I think you two have both covered it really, really well. I think the other place where people are maybe a little bit surprised there is seed funding is actually through collaboration with industry. There are pots of money to bring industry in to work with us, and that work, if you can get involved in a project like that, and we maybe will talk a bit more about how that can be done through engagement with the business engagement teams in Royce, in Geek, in other parts of the university. These can be a place for you to work with other people who are completely focused on impact right now, but they can give you the ideas for the more fundamental work that needs to be done to open something up longer term, so that you're not always starting at the bit of saying, what can I do in this fundamental space that can bring something forward? It can actually sometimes be, here's a problem where it just needs a little bit of insight and a bit of unblocking, and something that your experience can help do. And it might just be your advice that's wanted to guide another pair of hands that's already in the university. But you build a relationship with a company through doing that, and you, in that process, start to understand, well, actually, there's a deeper underlying problem here that could lead to some PhD funding or a research council grant or something like that then could lead to more translation 4, 5, 6 years, even more down the line. So I think this allowing yourself to have very long time horizons and to have touch points at different places in that is really important.
Yeah, thanks for those. And I think that what's really key is that, depending on the types of collaborations you want to build, then there are different pots of funding which you can go and seek. And the key is that there's a huge community of people either connected through the platforms or through the institutes that are sort of partnering with us today, who have those connections. And so, like, when you have a really good idea, you can then go and figure out, well, what's the best mechanism to try and answer some of those really early things and to get the validation that Ciara deserves. But I'm sure there's many other people who have great ideas who sort of need that validation as well. I think if we, and I realize that we have some internal and external people in the audience, but one of the things that is going to start for us in January is our cyclical judgment day. And judgment for us is a process which is called the Research Excellence Framework. So Ref is going to bear down on us again. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the process, well, one of the things that all academics have to do is we have to nominate publications, right? So we have to nominate papers or things that we have published. And we can do that up to 5 times, right? So we can nominate our top 5 papers. And all of us are really prepared for that. But actually, that has increasingly become a minority in how we are judged. And so we're actually judged on our research environments. How, as a university, are we supporting all of the cool things that we do? And we are judged on impact, right? And that impact is through impact case studies. So stories that we can tell which show that we are benefiting the world, right? And I actually think that's really refreshing, right? Rather than it being some sort of an academic competition for how many papers and nature fly tipping we have published, it's becoming really about how have we changed the world. And so this word impact is really important, but it's also sort of a bit amorphous. And so I was wondering if you guys could kind of define what impact means to you, and how does seeding disruptive things tie into that? Why are we sort of tethering seedcorn funding to that word impact? Now it's open, whoever wants to start.
I'll have a crack first. So I this is one you just can't nail down because it's completely broad as to what impact is. In something like REF, and I think it's interesting you raise REF because this makes people focus a lot on impact, and it's a measure that we have, but it's something where it generally means that we've helped someone make some money, helped someone employ more people, or something like that. Or that's been the lens for the past several years, and I think that has shifted to say, well, what's the difference that you have made? And I think the one thing I would take with impact is that when you're planning projects and planning the things that you're trying to do, you obviously have to have an idea of, well, what's the difference this could make in some, we just talked about the time scale. It could be some very long period of time. But I think a really key thing to do is, whilst you're working on the project, is to review it and review where the impact is, because it comes in unexpected places. I'll give one example about jobs where we've been running some work where one of our key things was, and we will be measured on it, is how many jobs we've created in the region. We've just worked with a company who've had a genuinely existential problem. They probably would employ 30, 35 people. If we didn't solve this problem, they probably wouldn't be in business in 2 or 3 years' time. And we think we've made enough progress. There's a lot of hope on the horizon. We think we're going to deal with this. So they will keep those jobs. Now, retention of jobs is never something people ever put in this is our impact, is going to save jobs. But actually, that's a key impact in this kind of thing. And what we've done in this is going, well, hang on, actually, we really need to look at where else we can be doing this. And I think that probably we will be stating this as a future impact in subsequent cases to earn money where we would never have thought of it. So that continuous reviewing, I think, is absolutely key when you're looking where your impact is. It can be in surprising places.
Yeah, I mean, I think I find the impact one, as you say, it's a really difficult thing, right? And it's changing all the time. And I think one of the things that I've learned coming into the interdisciplinary area of working is that I've had to kind of suspend my expectation of what that impact would look like. Because I think if in the circumstances of what we're trying to work in within that field of, we've got social scientists, we've got engineers trying to come together. I think if our group of engineers kept pushing forward and saying that we want this technical output, then I think we would lose the magic of what we're actually trying to achieve. So I think we have to sort of, in some ways, in these environments, suspend our disbelief a little bit and trust in the process that, as you say, sometimes that impact is going to be found in surprising places. What I have seen, and we're only halfway through our project, so we'll see what comes at the end, because who knows? But I think that what I have seen is that in some ways, thinking about those traditional metrics, because you can't forget about them, because we do get measured against them, and that idea of how are we going to publish the work or present the work to the world, that actually, in some ways, we've had to make less, I think, technical progress in the engineering field to get to something that's novel just by actually incorporating all of those different perspectives. It's brought us to somewhere very new. And so I think we will actually be able to publish our work maybe earlier than we even expected that we would be, if we'd just gone down a purely technical route. So I think that's quite a nice, unexpected element of impact, and potentially in a wider field as well, because it'll be open to more people, and understandable, and hopefully have an impact across a wider field. But I think the other thing is, as Mike says, is looking for impact in other areas. So we also now teach across faculties. So I teach on one of the courses within SEED, and we're looking at hopefully making it possible for our master's engineering students to actually take that course as part of their MSc or their MN year. And so there's going to be a really tangible, hopefully, exchange of ideas cross faculty, to try and embed social responsibility in our engineers when they're heading out into the world as well. So how you measure and how you count and how you demonstrate that impact going forward is a challenge, but I think we're getting better at that in terms of how we kind of assess and count those impacts, and I think that will make a difference as well. So it's not just about those measures that we're used to, but also that wider impact.
So I do agree with everything that you both said, but you don't want too much agreement on the panel. So I'm going to say that even though there is a complexity to impact, you can also boil it down to something quite simple, which it's, as I understand it, it's change. And it's change that is how impact's usually used is not necessarily the same as academic impact, not necessarily making a difference on your field, but making a difference on another part of society. But there's still lots of forms that could take. So it could be economic, but it doesn't have to be. It could be social. It could be cultural. It could be a change in understanding. Those are all types of impact. It also has to be something that you can evidence that something is different as a result of what you've done. So we see lots of amazing work that researchers are doing, which is definitely moving towards that direction. So they might be talking to GMCA, they might be talking to industry, they might be going out into local schools. That's a step on the road to impact. They're engaging and they're beginning to get the message across. But until there's evidence in some way that something's different, for me and for many of the people that look at it in this way, including the ref, it's not impact. But we've got a lot of expertise at Manchester in doing this. So I also think it's something that isn't scary. It's something that should be motivating. There's just not one way of doing it. So 2 other points. Impact doesn't just have to be linear. So it isn't that you do a publication and then something comes about it. Many of the people that have had the biggest change, it's much more wibbly wobbly than that. It's gone back and forth, and then it actually took a different direction, and then they did a different kind of publication out of it. So yeah, it can twist and turn, and a lot of the work is about planning for impact. So those types of activities I just talked about. Okay, who do I need to get the message across to? Who do I need to speak to who might help to make a difference and a change for it? So we do try and help people to build in those activities. But there's still a space for chance, and serendipitous impact is recognised even by those overlords who are assessing it.
So yeah, very, very quickly. Just the other thing I want to pick up is that some of the impact is with people in surprising ways. One of the things that those of us who work in these enormous buildings sometimes forget is how foreboding they are, and how people in a lot of small companies, for example, find it quite difficult to talk to a university. So just by engaging with a company and helping them get over that energy barrier of talking to us, you're having an impact in that company that they're starting to feel able to share the challenges they have in their innovation space or in their product development or whatever it is, and to come to us. And that we're seeing a fair bit of that at the moment, where companies are saying they're valuing the work they're doing with us, and they have never been anywhere near us, anywhere near the sector for a very long time. That's enormous.
So with industry, to industry, with policy, to people, to communities within our city region, globally, all of those things are impactful. And I think seedcorn helps broaden how we might think or define impact and take away some of those presumptions in the same way that it takes away disciplines. We are almost out of time. So very, very quick answer to one final question. So one of the things is we have Duncan as our new, what did you say, supreme overlord? Was that your phrasing? Yeah. And one of the things he's looking at right now is what we will look like as a university in 2035. And he has a big focus on interdisciplinarity and a big focus on impact. And so one thing I'll ask each of you is what do you think is missing. So what could we do as a university better as part of our 2035 strategy to help increase impact, particularly around sustainability?
Well, really short, break down silos.
I think what would be really nice to have would be like small, flexible, quick to access pots of funding. When you get halfway through something like an interdisciplinary project and it's taken a direction you didn't realize, and you're suddenly like, oh, sugar, a couple of £100 to run this workshop, bring this person in, I don't know, go to this conference, whatever, would be really helpful. I think those little quick to access pots of funding to top up would be really, really helpful to maximize the value of what you're already getting.
Off the back of that, actually things that help you to sustain it. So we are quite good at seeding, but actually sometimes things run over multiple years. So ways in which we don't have to wrap things up by the end of July, because that's when the end of a budget cycle ends.
Yeah, that last one resonated with people. So we are now at our lunch break. So we will be back at 13:40 for our next session. So please just join me in thanking our speakers on this panel and all of the speakers this morning.